Hi folks, this is our first project demo and I will be showing you how to use an X-acto knife and a ruler to cut a straight line with a piece of paper and how to start assembling the different angles and sides of your first geometric form. First we'll start with a little bit about safety. So when you are cutting with an X-acto knife, there are a couple of different things you have to consider so that you are less likely to slip and cut yourself. Make sure you have a nice clear space to work on. You should be provided with a cutting mat from the school, and then you also need a corked back metal ruler. This one is a foam back, this is the same thing. Make sure you're not using just a plain metal ruler without a cork backing on it. The cork backing keeps it from slipping when you're using it to cut. You want to generally make sure that you stand up when you are cutting with an X-acto knife. You have more control with your shoulders above you. So if I'm cutting with my X-acto knife and my table's really high and I'm having to reach like this to cut, I have much less control than if I am able to put weight down and have my shoulders above my workspace. So that's the first thing, is making sure that you're set up. If you have a high table or a high stool and it's hard to get in a comfortable position, then you'll want to stand up so that your shoulders are above you. You'll have more control. Next, you'll want to make sure that you have your line drawn nice and straight. I'll just do a quick example cut here, and so it doesn't really matter, but I'll draw a line here, and it depends on if you're right or left-handed. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to have my ruler on the left side of my line so that I can hold my knife with my right hand and use my left hand to steady my ruler. So I'm going to line my ruler up with that line that I've drawn, and then I'm going to actually use all of my strength. I'm going to focus my strength, I should say, on holding the ruler in place. And I'm going to put very little pressure on my knife blade. If I put a lot of pressure on my knife blade, I'm much more likely to slip and cut myself, or at least mess up my cut and not have a straight cut. Okay, so I'm going to hold my ruler nice and straight with a lot of force, and I'm just going to do a light cut. And sometimes that means that, depending on how sharp your blade is, it might take more than one time through the paper, even just with a piece of Bristol paper, to cut through. This is actually, I'm finding, a very dull knife blade. There we go, cut through. So this is just an example cut, like I said. So you can see, though, that it's a nice straight line, and it follows the line that I drew pretty precisely. I will switch to my other X-acto knife, which has a more fresh blade on it. Okay, so that's the basics of cutting just safely, all right? So a couple things to notice with the safety. You never want to be holding your ruler at some strange angle where then you have to cut across yourself, or reaching in a strange way. You always want to try to set up your cut so that it's facing straight towards yourself and it's nice and easy to cut this way. I never want to cut away from myself. You just have no control over your knife that way. Really, really dangerous. And certainly you never want to cross your hands over each other to cut like this or like this. You just have no control over what you're doing. Definitely accidents happen with X-acto knives. Just take your time. If you're ever feeling rushed or stressed out or tired, it's a good time to take a break and make sure that you're cutting nice and slowly and that you're concentrating. Okay, so to actually get started on this project, you can do some sketching first off and just sort of get some general ideas of shapes and forms that you want to use. But it's kind of impossible to fully plan out this project unless you were to use a 3D modeling software, which most of us don't have access to that technology. And this project is all about learning how to do things by hand anyways. So we won't use any 3D modeling software. So once you've kind of sketched out some general ideas of types of forms that you might be interested in using, it's a good time to start actually cutting out your shapes and try building it. And I find that it's best if you don't really try too hard to follow your sketch precisely. It's better to allow this to kind of happen organically a little bit, the project, and let one piece sort of guide you to the next piece and sort of experiment with the different shapes. Because it's, like I said, it's really hard to follow your original design super precisely. Okay, so for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to start with kind of a random shape and try it out, and then show you how I start this assignment. So I'm just going to draw, let's start with like a 5 or 6 sided shape, and I'm going to try a shape that has a variety of different lengths to its sides just to make it more interesting. Another thing that you want to try to avoid at the start, try to avoid having any right angles or parallel lines. If you look back at your project guidelines, it says that there are no more than 2 parallel lines or 2 right angles allowed in this assignment. And the reason for that is that rectangles and squares are pretty boring shapes and pretty predictable. So if you try to start with a shape that's a little bit more interesting than a rectangle or a square to begin with, you're less likely to make something boring and predictable, and more likely to make something that's dynamic. And that's one of the goals of this assignment, is to make something dynamic. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this shape out. So again, hold my ruler nice and securely. This blade is much sharper than the first blade. Notice that I'm turning my paper so that my ruler can be in a nice comfortable position, so I'm cutting towards myself and not away from myself. Make sure you cut right along the edge of your ruler and don't slide away from the edge. Another thing, the reason why we're using an X-acto knife and a ruler for cutting is that using a pair of scissors, you think, oh, well, that would be a lot faster, but it's actually a lot harder to cut a perfectly straight line with a pair of scissors. So this is a really good skill to learn. Okay, so here's my first shape. Okay, now I need to make this three-dimensional. This is a two-dimensional plane. So I need to make a shape that fits along one of these edges that I can tape on and then fold up into space, and that'll start creating 3 dimensions. So depending on what kind of ruler you have, I could measure this, and depending on whether you're used to inches or centimeters, you know, I could try to measure this really accurately. Let's see, it is just less than 3.5. Wow, and I've got 64ths of an inch on there, so 3 and 33/64. That's really a hard number to remember. So instead of trying to use your ruler to measure, I've had this school buy each of you a compass. Now, we're not going to use this compass for drawing circles in this project. We're going to use this compass as a measuring device. So notice that I can open this compass to fit this edge of my paper. And there's my measurement. Now, I didn't have to think about 30/2 of an inch or millimeters or any kind of measurement on my ruler. I'm just setting this to the exact size, and there it is. I'm going to make a little mark so I remember which side I'm making. And all I have to do is then transfer this distance from these 2 points onto the edge of my paper somewhere. So I'll start on the edge of my paper, because why start in the middle and have to cut all new sides when I have already a straight edge there? So I'm just going to start at this corner. Actually, I will make a little mark for one end, and then I'm going to put the point of my compass at that little mark, and then I'm going to make a little tick mark along the edge of my paper, right there. And then, I don't know if you can see those two marks, I'm sure they're pretty faint, but I've got a mark here and I've got a mark there. And those represent that length, right? Just the same as if I'd used my ruler and measured whatever annoying fraction that was and put that over here along the edge of my paper. It's the same thing, you know, this measurement is the same here. I just didn't have to think about ticks on a ruler and how to define those. Okay, so there's my first measurement, and it'll line up right here. And then I could draw whatever shape I want coming off of those 2 points so that it can go on there. And then, you know, do I want it to be some big shape that comes up into space? Do I want it to be a low, narrow shape? What kind of shape do I want? Totally up to you. It could be a triangle, it could be 4-sided, it could be 5-sided. I'm going to make it 4-sided. And again, I'm not going to use any right angles or parallel lines, just to try to make it more dynamic. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and cut that shape out. I apologize if some of you are left-handed and have to sort of look at my demo video and figure out how to do this in reverse. I know sometimes that can be tricky for people, but I don't think I'm coordinated enough to do a second demo video all backwards. Okay, so I've cut this second piece out and it will fit right there. That's my side that fits. And I'm going to put it in this direction. And I'm going to turn it upside down. So to actually put it together, I'm going to use masking tape. And I'm going to make my masking tape a little bit longer than the whole side, or the whole edge there. And I'm going to put it right down the middle of my line, nice and straight. And then I will trim off the excess. So it's always better to make your masking tape go a little bit too long and then trim off the excess, because then you know for sure that it holds everything securely. And it also makes a nice clean seam line, right? So now I can bend that up into space and I've got a nice joint. So you can see, because I taped it the full length, it does two things. It makes it a nice clean look visually. I don't know if you can see that with the how bright it is out here. There's not much contrast there now. But it also holds everything securely. If I put like a bunch of little pieces of tape along there, it won't be a clean edge and there will be little gaps where it's not held together securely. So it's best if you just make one long piece of tape the whole length and then cut off the excess. Okay, so now I can fold this into space and I've got my 3 dimensions. And again, it's hard to see the contrast, it looks like, in the screen. Okay, so next we need to figure out how to make a piece that fits in this gap, this corner. So this gets a little bit trickier, and this is where you need to pay close attention and try this a couple times, and maybe watch the video a few times to just really follow the instructions, and ask lots of questions if you don't understand it. This is something where in person I'm much more comfortable showing you this technique over and over again, but since we're remote, I can't physically help you along the way, so I'm going to have to just try to do it with the video and answer any questions that come up. Okay, so this is the arc method, and where you are going to draw arcs with your compass. And of course, I always make the joke that you can call it Noah's Ark. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to use our compass to measure the 2 sides that we do know. So I know this long side over here. And again, so I don't have to use my ruler to measure that super precisely. I'm just going to use my compass to open it to the exact measurement there, okay? Now I'm going to go to a longer clean side of my paper over here. and I'll make a mark. Notice I'm starting a little bit away from the corner. That's just because I don't know what the end angle will be, and that'll give me a little more space to work. I'm going to use my compass again to make that little tick mark to transfer that measurement along the edge of my paper. Make sure you can see that. Sometimes I like to just circle my marks, especially if my paper gets dirty and I've got lots of marks from other measurements. If I just circle the current ones, that I know what I'm using, which marks are important for this particular piece. Okay, so that was that first side. Now I know the second side over here of the piece that's folded up into space because it's already cut out. So again, I will measure that one with my compass. I don't know if you can, let me get an angle where you can really see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to just measure that, just open my compass to the measurement. Now this is going to be at an angle to my first piece. It's not just along the edge of my paper anymore. So, but I don't know what that angle is precisely because it will change depending on what angle I end up folding this at. So to include a bunch of different angles, I'm going to draw an arc. And if you imagine putting this point here, if I fold this piece of paper and follow it with my compass, I'm creating an arc that will represent where that piece of paper falls at different angles. So I'm going to place the point of my compass over here, and I'm just going to draw an arc. I'm going to draw a big one just because we're just starting out, and once you get the hang of it, you won't need to draw as much of that arc. But notice, again, I don't know if you can see the contrast of that. There's my arc. Notice that I didn't draw my arc all the way down to the edge of the paper over here or over here. I stopped it. And that's because I know that my I know that my angle isn't 0 degrees, which would be somewhere along here, and it's not 180 degrees. It doesn't open all the way out to flat, and it doesn't close all the way into flat. So again, if I go back to my piece here, it's not all the way flat down like this, that would be 0 degrees. And if it were open all the way like this, that would be 180 degrees. So it's neither of those. I know it's going to be somewhere in between. So I don't need to draw my arc all the way down to the edge. And the reason why I point that out is because I've got these two marks along the edge, and if I start drawing too many marks along the edge of my paper, it just gets visually confusing and I forget which mark is which. Okay, so now we need to figure out what angle I want this to be at, and I need to measure from point to point, and that will lock this angle in. See, if I measure a longer distance over here, then my angle is further out. If I fold this in, then I have a shorter distance over here. And that's to make a triangle. I didn't say that, but this piece that I'm making here is a triangle, right? If you think about it, 1, 2, 3 sides. Okay, so this is where it's a little bit tricky. I have to hold this at sort of precisely the angle that I want it to be at. And then I'm going to measure across that gap. So from the outer corner. So I'm going to put one point of my compass. Here, I'll try to get this again. Here, I'll move this over so you have more contrast. Sorry. I'm going to put the pencil under my compass down here, and then the other point of my compass up here. I don't know if you can see that. So here, let me try a different angle. So it goes from here up to there. Get my hand out of the way. Okay, so measuring across this gap from point then to point. Okay, so back to my piece of paper. Here's the moment of truth. So my first arc started from this point over here. So here's my first measurement along here, those two marks. My first arc was there, which represented this length, and then my second arc is going to go from the other end, the other mark of my first side. And I'm going to put my compass down on that point, and I'm just going to make a little tick mark where that meets up with my other arc. So then if I just circle that point, I've got a little cross between the two arcs. Again, let me hold this up so you can see it. So hopefully you guys can see that. So we've got the first arc, which I drew really big, starting at this side of my first measurement. My second side of my first measurement is over here, and my second arc was a lot bigger, so it went all the way, and I just made that little mark where the two of the arcs cross. Okay, and that will show us where the three sides of our triangle line up. So if I draw that, if I connect my points, it will look like this. Okay, so there's my triangle. Now that will fit, once I cut it out, right into the corner of this. So let me cut that out. Okay, and then cut the second side. Okay, so I've cut my triangle out that I just drew, and my first side fits right along here. My second side fits right along here. And because I use the arc method, the angles will all fit together and it will fill in this space. Okay, so I'll go ahead and tape that in now. So again, I'm going to put it flat. I'll make a piece of tape. So a little bit longer than the whole side. I cut off my excess. Oops, it's my old dull knife. Okay, so that will fold up. Whoops, I didn't get it lined up very well. Let's get that lined up a little bit better. Okay. Masking tape, the more pressure you put on it, the better it will stick. So if you can rub it a little bit like that, it'll stick a lot better. And then I need this little piece, the little corner, little edge. So I sometimes use my fingernail or thumbnail to rub the tape down. And then I've got excess tape over here. Trim that carefully. Careful not to slip, hurt myself. There we go. And there are my first three pieces of my little paper sculpture. Now, next I might just want to build something that comes off in some other direction. Notice that everything I've done so far is a convex angle, right? Everything is protruding out. Maybe I want to do a concave angle, so I could bring something over here. Obviously this piece doesn't fit, but I could make it come out this way to create more complexity or make it more dynamic. You'll sort of figure out what kind of shapes you want to use. Okay, so I could cut another piece, like use this scrap piece of triangle and fit it and just cut it off so that it continues my form. That would be a good way to go. That would be the next step. Okay.